that's one of the things we can learn from comparing. Is there other things that we can learn from, like comparing, yeah, like Luke in particular with and Herodotus histories?
Hmm. So I think some comparisons. One of the things with Herodotus in particular, and not just his successors, is that he really has an intense interest in the different peoples. So he grew up in Halicarnassus, which is modern day Turkey. Bodrum is the city today, and it's on the west coast of Turkey. And he grew up in that on that area where the Greek colonies were. And at some point, it seems that he and his family had to leave, probably because the Persians were coming.
Hmm.
And he just has and he starts to travel, and we don't know the exact stages, but it seems that he just traveled and he noted down things. And in the way he tells his story about the Greco-Persian wars, was that as he does that, whenever he, not every point, but when he mentions a particular people, he starts to talk about their history, where they came from, what are they like, and
Hmm.
everything. So he has an intense interest in the way peoples developed. I don't use the word nations because it's a little bit anachronistic, but
Yeah, sure.
he's interested in their politics. He's interested in their culture. So you could almost say that Herodotus produces one of the first ethnographic studies, along with telling about the Greco-Persian Wars. So I think his interest in all these peoples, and I think that's a very interesting parallel with Luke and Acts, because from the first chapters of the Gospel of Luke, we see that Luke has an intense interest in telling Theophilus and the readers like Theophilus, that Jesus did not come to be the savior only of Israel, but also of the other peoples.
Hmm.
So, and you see that, the trajectory is from Jerusalem to Rome. And I think if Herodotus had lived in Luke's times, he probably would have liked that. He might not have liked that, Luke is telling a story of a savior from the Jews. I don't know. But the fact that he has this interest, which is so broad and concerns so many different peoples, and he shows how Paul goes into these different regions, announces the gospel, and communities start to develop. And I think that's an interesting parallel.
Hmm.
They both had very, very big perspectives,
Yeah, yeah.
geographically and culturally.
And pretty accurate with in what they sort of like depicted as well.
Yes.
So I know. So in the beginning of Luke's gospel, he lays down how he has got hold of the sources he's been writing, his sources, how he for the gospel, and how does that sort of like laying out, saying I got the sources, I'm meticulous about this. How that compared to like how ancient history, other ancient historians like plotted those things down.
Right. So one of the interesting, another parallel, but we don't have to go into depth on this, is
Hmm.
if you compare the preface of the Gospel of Luke, so the very first four verses, it's actually one paragraph in Greek, and in most
Hmm.
translations, I think it's also just one paragraph. It's not, it's very long.
Hmm.
If we look at the beginning of Herodotus' histories, it's also very short, and it's 39 words, whereas Luke's preface is 41 words. And those can be compared, and I do that in my work here.
Hmm.
Neither one says God or the God specifically, but one of the things that they highlight is the great things, the great and marvelous works, Herodotus says. And Luke also says in the first lines, he says, since many have set their hand to compile an account concerning the events that have taken place or accomplished among us. So they're focusing on things that are worth exploring. And I think that's an interesting parallel there. Luke talks specifically about eyewitnesses, right? So he talks about just as the eyewitnesses from the beginning, who also became servants of the word, handed down or transmitted to us. So there he's focusing on something that was very important. People who saw, who were with Jesus at the time. So that was obviously in ancient times an important source. People who actually saw the events, who took part in them. As you can imagine, it was not always easy for a historian to interview people, especially if Herodotus was probably writing in, maybe the 430s about a war that had already been finished for 40 years. So, it wasn't impossible that he could have interviewed some people who had actually taken part in the Greco-Persian Wars. But he also could have received things through hearsay, things that were passed down verbally, orally. And he received those. And he did interviews with people. For example, when we think he went to Egypt, he has the book two of Herodotus is entirely focused on Egypt, and the way he presents it, it sounds like he's basing the account on interviews with especially with priests who were the kind of the historians of those. They were the ones who kept chronicles. So that's very interesting. So you have eyewitnesses and people who have heard things and passed down. And then you also have inscriptions. You have monuments that were still around. If you could go visit the places where major battles took place, or to go to sanctuaries, oracles, like Delphi, because very often in the oracle centers, they not only kept a lot of things that were given as ex voto offerings, things to thank the gods for victory or something that happened to them in response to their prayers. So there are different ways that they could compile their histories. I think it's mind blowing how these historians did their work. It really is amazing. Just one thing that might interest some is that Thucydides is one of the first to say now about speeches, specifically speeches in history writing. So how do you know what someone said in a speech if you were not there? So you might have a written source somehow, if you're lucky, like a court recording or proceeding. That was really hard to get, even impossible in certain cases. Or you might be able to do an interview with someone and say, okay, that guy was there. Tell me what he said. If you didn't have that, what Thucydides says, I know approximately what they said. Given the context, given the people that I know, he composed speeches based on what he probably said. And so that raises the question about the things that we have in the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, where we find speeches. Either, for example, in the first two chapters, you have the prayer of Zechariah, the prayer of Mary, what Simeon says to Mary and Joseph. And then you have Jesus' teachings. And in the Acts of the Apostles, you have some speeches, Peter, Stephen, Paul, Barnabas. And historiographically, you should ask, well, what were his sources? How did he get those things? How did he know exactly what Mary said when she prayed? When it was the angel who came to her and she responded in that way and then she prayed. So responded and then responded by that prayer. So those are things that are interesting. How much freedom did the evangelists have in composing the speeches that we have?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing is for sure, most likely in the Acts of the Apostles, we don't have the full text.
Yeah.
When Paul speaks before Festus or Felix, and the longest speech that we have in Acts is actually the speech of Stephen. So, I mean, it was probably longer. So I think that helps us if we study the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles in light of history writing. It was acceptable to do that kind of thing. Say, okay, these are the things that were probably said. But we don't want to exclude, for Luke, Matthew, Mark, and John, that they may have had their sources, either written or verbal or oral sources. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting thread to follow in history writing.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. Yeah, they possibly even might have interviewed people that has been there, or some of the people that have longer speeches from. They might have talked to them.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much Zachariah, because he might have passed away by the time.
Right. Yeah.
But maybe people who heard him say it.
Sure. Yeah. So there are a lot of things like that, questions that are raised.
Thank you for watching this clip. If you enjoyed it, you can find another one by clicking just over here. Or if you want to watch the full episode and dive a step deeper, you can find a link in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.